You've seen it in movies, in music videos, on postcards. Every New Year's Eve, 1 billion people watch that ball drop on television and think, I want to be there one day. And every year, about 50 million people actually show up. They stand in the middle of it all, phones up, eyes wide, completely convinced they've arrived somewhere magical. Most of them have no idea what's actually going on around them. This is the dark truth about Times Square that tourists aren't told. The crossroads of the world was once called something else entirely. Before Times Square was Times Square, it was Longacre Square, and it was not glamorous. In the late 1800s, this was the center of New York's carriage industry. Blacksmiths, stables, harness shops. The whole area smelled like horses and manure, and the people who worked there were not exactly the city's elite. The transformation happened fast, and it happened because of a newspaper. In 1904, Adolph Ochs, the publisher of the New York Times, convinced the city to rename the square after his paper when he moved the Times headquarters there. He also convinced the city to build a subway station underneath it, which was a very clever way to guarantee foot traffic to your front door. On December 31st, 1904, Ochs threw a massive fireworks celebration to mark the opening of the new Times Tower. Around 200,000 people showed up. The tradition stuck, and the paper got its name plastered permanently on one of the most visited intersections on Earth. The Times actually moved out of the building in 1913. They've been gone for over a century. The name stayed. What replaced the carriage trade was theater. Between roughly 1900 and 1930, Times Square became the center of American commercial entertainment. Vaudeville houses, legitimate theaters, movie palaces, and hotels packed into a corridor that became known internationally as the Great White Way, a nickname that referred to the density of electric street lighting at a time when most of the world still used gas lamps. At its peak in the 1920s, there were over 80 theaters operating within walking distance of the square itself. That concentration of entertainment, all feeding off a newly electrified transit system that brought audiences in from across the boroughs and beyond, made Times Square something genuinely new. A kind of entertainment district that had no real precedent anywhere in the world at that scale. The ball drop almost didn't survive. The ball drop is the thing everyone associates with Times Square. It's been going on since 1907, 3 years after the fireworks tradition started, and it's been called a symbol of new beginnings ever since. But here's what most people don't know. The ball itself almost didn't exist. In 1907, the city banned the fireworks that had been launched from the top of the Times Tower since 1904, citing safety concerns about pyrotechnics over dense crowds. Ochs needed a replacement spectacle. They commissioned a 700-pound iron and wood ball covered in light bulbs and lowered it down a flagpole at midnight. It worked. People loved it. Then, during World War II, the ball was completely dark for 2 years, 1942 and 1943. Wartime blackout regulations prohibited the kind of illumination the drop required. Instead, those midnight moments were marked with a moment of silence and the sound of chimes. Imagine standing in Times Square at midnight in the middle of a world war, in the dark, listening to bells. That's something no postcard ever mentions. The ball has been redesigned multiple times since then. As of 2025, the current version, called the Constellation Ball, weighs 12,350 pounds, is covered in 5,280 circular Waterford crystal panels, and is illuminated by 5,280 LED light pucks. It's the largest ball yet and debuted for the 2025 to 2026 New Year's Eve celebration. It hasn't missed a drop since 1945. The New Year's Eve crowd is not what it looks like on TV. Television makes the New Year's Eve celebration look like the greatest party on Earth. What it doesn't show you is that the people standing in those designated viewing pens, and they are pens, have often been standing there since early afternoon. There are no bathrooms inside the cordoned areas. You cannot leave and come back. If you step out to find a restroom, your spot is gone. Security does not make exceptions, so people either hold it for hours or they come prepared in ways that are not exactly dignified. The temperature in New York on December 31st averages around 32 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. In 2022, it was in 40 degrees, considered warm for the occasion. In 2018, it was below 10 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind chill that brought it to -4. About 58,000 people still showed up. Many of them stood in those outdoor pens for 6, 7, 8 hours. Former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani once called it the most exciting place in the world to be on New Year's Eve. He said that from a heated indoor venue. The viewing areas are divided into numbered sections, and access is assigned by where you enter. Once you're in a section, you stay there. The ball drops from a building you may or may not be able to see clearly, depending on which pen you're standing in. Some sections have completely obstructed sightlines and watch the countdown on a screen. The crowd is large enough that if something goes wrong, if someone has a medical emergency, if a fight breaks out, getting emergency personnel through takes time. The NYPD deploys roughly 7,000 officers for the event, which gives you a sense of the logistical scale involved. And yet, people come back. Some people make it an annual tradition. There is something about being physically present at a moment the whole world is watching that pulls people through the cold and the crowds and the no bathroom situation. It's worth understanding clearly before you decide you want to do it. The TKTS booth and the real cost of being there. Times Square markets itself as entertainment for everyone, but nothing about it is actually free if you're planning to do more than stand on the sidewalk and look around. The TKTS booth, the famous red-staired structure where tourists line up to buy discounted Broadway tickets, is genuinely useful, and discount tickets are real. Shows can be 20 to 50% off, but the lines are long, and the cheapest seats for the most popular shows still run well over $100 per person. A family of 4 can easily spend $600 to $800 on a single night of theater. Dinner in the Times Square area is another story. The neighborhood is one of the most aggressively tourist-priced dining zones in the entire country. Mediocre chain restaurants charge Manhattan premium prices. A basic pasta dish at a mid-tier Times Square restaurant can run $30 to $40. A burger and fries at a sports bar, $25. The closer you are to the actual square, the worse the math gets. New York City's tourism board consistently ranks Times Square among the top 3 most visited tourist attractions in the world, alongside sites like the Eiffel Tower and the Colosseum. Unlike those sites, Times Square doesn't have an admission fee, it just finds other ways to empty your wallet. A basic pasta dish at a mid-tier Times Square restaurant can run $30 to $40. A burger and fries at a sports bar, $25. The closer you are to the actual square, the worse the math gets. New York City's tourism board consistently ranks Times Square among the top 3 most visited tourist attractions in the world, alongside sites like the Eiffel Tower and the Colosseum. Unlike those sites, Times Square doesn't have an admission fee, it just finds other ways to empty your wallet. The characters and costumes. Read this before you hand over any money. If you've been to Times Square, you've seen them. Elmo, Spider-Man, Mickey Mouse, the Naked Cowboy, various statues of liberty. They pose for photos. They wave at children. They beckon you over with a grin. And then comes the ask. These costumed characters are not employed by anyone official. They are independent operators working one of the busiest tourist corridors in the world. And the tipping situation has, over the years, become something of a pressure campaign. In 2014 and 2015, the city received enough complaints about aggressive tipping demands, including cases of harassment and physical confrontation, that the New York City Council actually debated legislation to license and regulate the performers. Several characters were arrested for harassment and, in a handful of cases, assault. The city eventually created designated activity zones in 2016, confining the costume performers to specific painted areas. It helped somewhat. Outside of those zones, the sidewalks still feature a rotating cast of performers, living statues, and people selling things that don't have obvious price tags. The general advice from anyone who has spent real time in Times Square is simple. If you want a photo with a costumed character, agree on a price beforehand. in cash, out loud, in front of witnesses. The naked cowboy, whose real name is Robert Burke, has been a Times Square fixture since 1998. He trademarked his character, has sued companies for unauthorized use of his likeness, and at one point reportedly made around $150,000 a year posing for photos in his underwear in the middle of New York City. He's run for public office, twice, and considers himself a genuine Times Square institution, which, by any reasonable definition, he is. Whatever you think of the spectacle, the man understood his market and built a career around it that outlasted dozens of businesses that came and went on those same blocks. The scaffolding, the billboards, and who's actually paying for all of this. Times Square is one of the most advertised locations on Earth. The billboards are not just decoration. They are the entire economic engine of the area. A single large digital billboard in Times Square can rent for anywhere from $1.1 million to $4 million per year. During premium moments like New Year's Eve or major sporting events, rates go higher. Advertisers pay those rates because Times Square delivers an audience that almost no other outdoor location can match. An estimated 380,000 people pass through on an average day. During peak tourist season, that number climbs closer to 450,000. Here's the part the glossy tourism brochures skip. Times Square has a zoning regulation that actually requires illuminated signage on commercial buildings. It's one of the only places in the United States where a building owner is legally obligated to keep their facade lit up. This rule dates back to 1987, when the city was trying to revitalize the area and decided the lights themselves were a public asset worth protecting. So the spectacular glow you're photographing? It's partly a legal requirement. What Times Square looked like before the cleanup. If you're over 35, you may have heard adults talk about the old Times Square in a tone that was equal parts disgust and reluctant fascination. If you grew up after the mid-1990s, you essentially missed an entirely different version of this neighborhood. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, Times Square was one of the most notoriously dangerous urban corridors in America. 42nd Street in particular, now lined with AMC theaters, Dave & Buster's, and chain restaurants, was saturated with sex shops, peep shows, adult movie theaters, and street crime. The New York City Transit Authority's statistics from the late 1970s show that the subway stations under Times Square had some of the highest rates of robbery and assault in the entire system. Writer Luc Sante, who documented New York City's underworld extensively, once described 42nd Street in that era as a 24-hour city within the city, where transactions occurred that the rest of the population preferred not to acknowledge. The turnaround began in earnest in the early 1990s under Mayor David Dinkins and accelerated dramatically under Mayor Rudy Giuliani's administration. Property buyouts, zoning changes, the introduction of the Business Improvement District, and a sustained police crackdown transformed the area over roughly a decade. By 1997, Disney had moved into 42nd Street with a flagship theater. When Disney moves in, the era is officially over. Some longtime New Yorkers have complicated feelings about what was lost in the cleanup. Not the crime, but a certain rawness that was genuinely New York and genuinely gone. The filmmaker and author Paul Auster, who lived in New York through those decades, wrote about the city of that era as a place where failure and ambition existed right next to each other without pretense. That quality, the friction, the unpolished edges, was part of what made New York feel different from everywhere else. The new Times Square is efficient, safe, and profitable. It's also legible in a way the old one never was. You always know exactly what it wants from you. The real estate transformation was staggering in its speed and scale. Buildings that had housed sex shops and single-room occupancy hotels for decades were razed or gutted and converted into hotels, office towers, and entertainment venues. Property values that had been suppressed by crime and stigma exploded upward through the late 1990s and 2000s. The people who had been living cheaply in the area, artists, recent immigrants, people on the margins of the city's economy, were displaced at a pace that the city's housing system couldn't absorb. That's a consequence that rarely comes up in the civic celebrations of the cleanup. The subway underneath is a world of its own. Most tourists experience the Times Square subway station as a chaotic necessity, a way to get somewhere else. What they don't realize is that the station complex beneath Times Square and 42nd Street is one of the largest and most complicated transit hubs in the entire Western Hemisphere. The station connects the N, Q, R, W, S, 1, 2, 3, 7, A, C, and E subway lines. Navigating the transfers between all of these requires knowing which corridors connect, which don't, and where the unmarked staircases go. The station sprawls across multiple city blocks underground, and getting from one platform to another can take 5 to 10 minutes of walking through tunnels. In 2019, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority reported that Times Square 42nd Street was the busiest station in the New York City subway system, with approximately 65 million annual entries. To put that in context, that's more annual visitors than Disneyland. The station also has a surprisingly rich artistic history. The Arts for Transit program has installed murals, mosaics, and sculptures throughout the station complex. Jacob Lawrence's mosaic panels, installed in 2001, depict scenes of human migration and are considered significant works of public art. Most commuters walk past them every day without stopping. The station's complexity is also a source of legitimate confusion for visitors. The signage in some corridors has been criticized by urban planners and transit advocates for decades as genuinely inadequate. A remarkable thing to say about a station that handles tens of millions of people annually. During peak hours, the platforms can reach densities that make movement uncomfortable and, in crowd-crush scenarios, potentially dangerous. The MTA has made significant improvements over the years, but anyone who has tried to catch the 7 train at 5 p.m. on a Friday knows that the infrastructure is perpetually catching up with the demand. Every night at midnight, Times Square does something that very few tourists know about unless they happen to be there at that exact hour. At 11:57 p.m., every digital billboard in Times Square simultaneously switches to a curated display of art. Animated pieces created specifically for the space by artists from around the world. This runs for exactly 3 minutes, from 11:57 to midnight every single night of the year. It's called the Midnight Moment, and it's been coordinated by the Times Square Alliance and the nonprofit Times Square Arts since 2012. The program has featured work from hundreds of artists across dozens of countries. The screens are, for those 3 minutes, entirely free of advertising. The pedestrian plaza was an experiment that nearly didn't happen. If you've walked through Times Square in the last 15 years, you may have noticed that the central section of Broadway is closed to cars and replaced with tables, chairs, and pedestrian space. That transformation is relatively recent, and it was initially sold as a temporary experiment. In 2009, Mayor Michael Bloomberg's transportation commissioner, Jeanette Sadiq Khan, proposed closing Broadway to vehicle traffic between 42nd and 47th Streets as a pilot program. The New York City taxi industry hated the idea. Many business owners were skeptical. Critics predicted gridlock throughout Midtown. What actually happened was the opposite. Traffic flow in the surrounding streets improved. Pedestrian injuries in the area dropped by 40%. Retail sales along the corridor went up. The experiment was made permanent in 2010. Sadiq Khan later said in interviews that the resistance to the plan was fierce until the data came in. And then it wasn't. The plaza is now one of the most photographed public spaces in the country. It was created against significant opposition, survived as a temporary measure and became permanent because the numbers were too good to argue with. The rent situation and why every store looks the same. One question that visitors occasionally wonder, probably while standing in front of the fourth M&M's branded store they've passed in 2 blocks, why does every retail space in Times Square seem to be occupied by either a candy store, a chain restaurant, or a souvenir shop? The answer is rent. Ground floor retail space in Times Square has, at peak moments, rented for among the highest per square foot rates of any retail in the world, comparable to the Champs-Élysées in Paris and Causeway Bay in Hong Kong. Only businesses with extremely high per visitor revenue can sustain those leases. Souvenir stores, candy shops, fast food, and tourist-oriented chains all operate on high volume, low complexity models that can actually absorb those costs. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Times Square retail vacancy rates climbed to roughly 30% in some blocks, a striking number for an area that normally operates at near full occupancy. Some landlords held out for top-dollar tenants rather than reduce rents. The result was rows of darkened storefronts in one of the most famous commercial corridors in the world. Recovery came slowly, and the mix of tenants has shifted somewhat since then. But the economics that produce a neighborhood of chain stores and candy emporiums haven't changed. There have also been waves of novelty concept stores that open specifically to capitalize on Times Square's foot traffic. Stores with almost no lasting product logic, built entirely around the idea that millions of people will walk past and some percentage will walk in. A significant number of these have cycled through the same storefronts within a few years of opening. The corner at 46th Street and Broadway has, at various points in the last 2 decades, housed a rotating series of large-format retail concepts that lasted a year or 2 before giving way to the next version of the same idea. What remains consistently is the high-volume, low-dwell-time retail model. The thing you grab on your way somewhere else, or the overpriced souvenir you buy because you're standing in front of it and the moment feels right. Times Square is very good at creating that feeling. That's not accidental. Times Square has been the site of several violent incidents that don't fit into the tourist narrative at all. In May 2010, a car bomb was found in a parked vehicle in the heart of Times Square. The device failed to detonate. A street vendor noticed smoke coming from a Nissan Pathfinder parked near 45th Street and alerted police. The area was evacuated. Faisal Shahzad was arrested 2 days later, attempting to flee the country, and was subsequently convicted. The bomb, had it gone off, would have caused significant casualties in one of the most crowded public spaces in the United States. In 2017, a man drove a vehicle intentionally into a crowd of pedestrians near 45th Street, killing 1 person, an 18-year-old tourist from Michigan, and injuring 22 others. The driver, Richard Rojas, a Navy veteran, was found to have ingested PCP and had a documented history of mental illness. He was later found not criminally responsible by reason of insanity and was committed to a psychiatric facility. In 2021, a 4-year-old girl and 2 adult women were shot in Times Square when a dispute between individuals escalated into gunfire in broad daylight in front of tourists. These incidents are known, reported, and documented. But the Times Square brand, the ball, the lights, the celebration, has a gravitational pull that tends to keep them at the edge of public memory rather than the center. What the tourists don't see when the cameras pan away. New York City's shelter system houses tens of thousands of people on any given night. Times Square and the surrounding Midtown area have historically been home to a significant portion of the city's unhoused population, particularly in the subway system below. During the COVID-19 pandemic, subway ridership dropped by more than 90% at certain points. The station beneath Times Square, along with other major hubs, became a de facto shelter for people with nowhere else to go. The city deployed outreach teams, social workers, and eventually police to clear encampments in the subway system in 2021 and 2022. Above ground, the pedestrian plaza and the surrounding streets have their own patterns. visible to anyone who walks through at 3 a.m. rather than 3 p.m. The late-night version of Times Square is a different neighborhood than the one in the travel brochures. The city spends considerable resources on Times Square specifically because the area's image is tied to tourism revenue that matters enormously to New York's economy. Perceptions of safety are maintained carefully because they are expensive to lose and slow to rebuild. The Business Improvement District for Times Square, the organization that handles maintenance, security supplements, and public programming for the area, has an annual budget in the tens of millions of dollars. Much of that goes toward keeping the pedestrian plaza clean, keeping the lighting maintained, and ensuring that the experience of walking through Times Square at 2 in the afternoon feels consistent with the brand. It's a managed environment in a way that's easy to miss if you're just passing through, but becomes obvious once you start noticing the staffing levels, the frequency of sanitation sweeps, and the number of people in official-looking vests whose only job seems to be making sure things look a certain way. The contrast between that managed daytime experience and what the neighborhood looks and feels like at 4 in the morning is something that's hard to describe without sounding alarmist. It's not dangerous in the way the old Times Square was dangerous. It's just different, quieter, stranger, with different people doing different things for different reasons. The city that never sleeps has moods, and Times Square goes through several of them before sunrise. The 1% of Times Square that almost nobody visits. Walk 1 block east of Times Square's eastern edge, just 1 block, and you're in a different city. The density of tourists drops immediately. The restaurants have actual menus that aren't laminated and illustrated with photographs of every dish. The prices are different. 2 blocks north of 47th Street, you're in the edge of the theater district proper, where the actual Broadway houses sit, many of them on side streets that tourists routinely walk past without realizing what's inside. The Schubert Theater, where a chorus line ran for 15 years, is on 44th Street. The St. James Theater, where Oklahoma premiered, is on 44th Street too. Neither of them is visible from the main square. The New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center is about a mile north. It holds one of the most significant collections of theater, music, and dance archives in the world, and it's free to visit. It sees a fraction of the foot traffic that the M&M's store does. This is not a criticism of anyone who comes to Times Square for the lights and the energy, but there is a version of this neighborhood and this city that exists about 50 feet from where most people are standing, and it almost never makes it into anyone's Instagram feed. Times Square is genuinely remarkable. The scale of it, the noise, the sheer compression of human activity into a few city blocks, there's nowhere quite like it. But remarkable and honest are different things, and Times Square has always been very good at showing you exactly what it wants you to see. The horses are gone. The crime is mostly gone. The newspapers that gave it its name moved out over 100 years ago. What's left is a machine designed to absorb your attention, your time, and your money with impressive efficiency. A machine that has been tuned and adjusted and legally mandated to glow for over a century so that the next wave of people standing under those lights feels the exact same thing the last wave did. That feeling is real. The lights are real. The history underneath all of it is just less photogenic. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go. It means you should go knowing what you're actually walking into. And now you do. If you found this video interesting, hit the like button and subscribe. There's a lot more of this kind of thing coming, and you don't want to miss it.